Ever feel like something's stalking you? Just waiting to snap you up? It feels like you're being targeted by ads. But there's an escape. For just $1 a month on Patreon, you can watch our videos completely ad-free. You can also get your name in the credits, vote on what animals we talk about, attend live streams, and more. Support from viewers lets us keep making videos and lets you escape the ads. Go to patreon.com/YDAW. The link is in the description. Don't let the Quetzalcoatlus get you. Oh, unhand me at once! Quetzalcoatlus was, for decades, in a similar situation to what we saw with Giganotosaurus. We had an initial description and a few bones described, but the rest of the skeleton had not gotten a formal description. So, despite 50 years of pop cultural depictions and a lot of scientific interest, if you wanted to actually work with the animal, you needed to either contact or be one of the people with physical access. Unlike Giganotosaurus, Quetzalcoatlus, the genus, is known from broken but very complete remains. We have most of the skeleton represented. Asterisk. Also, unlike Giganotosaurus, this story actually gets closure, by which I mean we got a full osteology in 2021. Finally, instead of relying on other Azhdarkids to fill in Quetzalcoatlus's anatomy, we can actually study it on its own, instead of as like this abstracted, heavy giant flyer that you can use to test your modeling. That's what Quetzalcoatlus was before 2021. It's where your graph ends. As for what took so long, well, first they had to get it all out of the ground. Azhdarkids, by nature, are kind of tantalizingly poorly preserved. Their bones are like packing peanuts in balsa wood. Plenty strong in life. Like, one reason for the hollowness is that it lets them have bones with a larger volume, which means they can resist torsion and buckling on a budget. But it does mean that they tend to go to pieces once they are dead and fossilized, especially since we tend to find these guys in terrestrial deposits. Deposits like the Upper Javelina and Lower Black Peaks formations of Big Bend, Texas. This is formerly the Tornillo Clay Formation, but that's a group now. This is Maastrichtian rock. Quetzalcoatlus is from the very end of the Cretaceous, where in the second half of the 20th century, this rock was prospected by teams out of Austin under the leadership of Juan Langston. Dozens of people have worked on this material and all the animals from Big Bend, but everybody emphasizes the efforts of Juan to collect, prepare, restore, reconstruct, and study these animals, Quetzalcoatlus in particular. It was another worker, Douglas Lawson, who originally found the Northropi holotype weathering out an arroyo in 1971. He collected much of it as float, which is to say loose fossils, or loose fragments more accurately. There were some bones in situ, still in the rock intact, but to this day, the Quetzalcoatlus Northropi holotype contains more than 1,000 bone fragments. They pieced what they'd found back together in the lab and found that they had most of a forearm, wrist, and hand. It was obviously a pterosaur because nothing else has such thin-walled bones, but it was shockingly large. Like, there were no good remains of a pterosaur this large up to this point. And no disrespect intended to Armborgiania, but it's one thing to have part of a neck vertebra and extrapolate, well, I think that the animal that it came from would be this big, versus, wow, look at this giant wing we found. Teams returned to the understandably named Big Wing Hill in 1973 and 74 and got the remainder of the Northropi holotype out. Lawson's preliminary description followed the next year. Workers have actually revisited this site a couple of times in 1984 and 91, but no more of this individual has ever turned up. Most of the pterosaur material from Big Bend has come from a different site. This came to be called Pterodactyl Ridge after 1973, when Bill Amaral made the discovery of multiple individuals of a large pterosaur that we came to call the small morph of Quetzalcoatlus. As of 2021, this is confirmed to be a separate species, Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, but in previous literature it was usually referred to Quetzalcoatlus sp, meaning indeterminate species. What's interesting about lawsoni is that it is about half the size of Northropi. This is something that seems to happen a lot with Azhdarkids. Everywhere that we find well-preserved pterosaur fauna, we find a mixed size class with one small-ish animal, small being relative, and one giant. By any objective criterion, Lawsoni is a large pterosaur. It's got a 4.6 meter wingspan, which is apparently similar to the clade's namesake, Azhdarco. But then you have Quetzalcoatlus northropi with a wingspan of 10 meters or more. This is comparable to the wingspan we reconstruct for Arenborgia or Hatzegopteryx. We have a number of giant Azhdarkids that are all brushing up against the largest we think Azhdarkids could actually get, and I don't think it's useful to get into the nitty-gritty of like which one was actually the largest, because that feels a little like, oh, my pterosaur could beat up your pterosaur, and that doesn't feel productive. Especially since Hatzegopteryx would win. There's actually even more Azhdarkids from Javelina. We have an indeterminate giant about the size of Northropi, which might actually be Northropi, more on that in a minute. We have a little guy about half the size of Lawsoni that seems to maybe be genus Quetzalcoatlus also, and we have Welnopterus, which is mid-sized for an Azhdarkid pterosaur, but with this short, deep beak on it. Now, like Lawsoni, that animal wasn't officially named until 2021, but it was recovered in 85 and 86. Langston wrote that they thought that it was going to be another Quetzalcoatlus specimen, because of course it would be, but then they got to the snout sooner than expected. Crews had been coming back to Pterodactyl Ridge almost annually through 85, and sometimes they would collect stuff that had just naturally weathered out, sometimes they had to actually excavate some bones. It wasn't until 79 that they found a reasonably complete pectoral girdle and wing of Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, and that was exciting because they finally could understand the proportions of the giant species. Now, as I said at the top, getting the fossils to the lab was only step one. Preparation and reconstruction carried on for like 3 decades. And one idiosyncratic avenue of research was the construction of models, none of them as spectacular as this ornithopter called QN, which Langston was a consultant on. This was a project, again, in the mid-80s, where they built successively larger models culminating in a half scale, which means about 5-meter wingspan, autonomous flying, lifelike replica of Quetzalcoatlus, which only weighed like 32 kilograms, which is unusually prescient. It actually flew pretty well given the technology of the time, though it did require a human remote control pilot, onboard actuators to adjust it on the fly, literally on the fly, and a detachable airplane tail for taking off. But it flew well enough to appear in a Smithsonian IMAX film on the wing. Now, I don't know if QN is the origin point of this particular neck pose, but it is the earliest example I found of posturing Quetzalcoatlus's neck with this... It looks like the Looney Tunes vulture. You know the one I'm talking about? That's what this crook reminds me of. But it seems that even though now we have assembled a complete cervical series, that is the neck vertebrae of this animal, that work was not yet completed in 85. But early depictions of this animal, and these two toys at least, really undersell the length of the neck. It should be at least twice this long. The neck is actually how we identify Azhdarkids. They have these really distinctive, long, tubular, simplified vertebrae, to the point that they're sometimes mistaken for limb bones, because the neural spines are so reduced. Specifically the vertebrae in the middle of the neck. These are numbers 3 through 7. The vertebrae at the beginning and end of the neck are more conventional. In the late 80s, finds elsewhere in the world caused some workers to notice, oh, we should construct a group for animals with these distinctive, simple tubular neck vertebrae. And they called it Azhdarkidae, after the name of a Persian dragon. I see you typing. It's a dragon. Google Azhdarha, you will see pictures of dragons. Now, those long neck vertebrae actually have fairly stiff joint articulations, whereas the shorter vertebrae at the base of the neck or near the head are more flexible and have more obvious attachment points for muscles and ligaments. The overall effect is that the neck was surprisingly bendy, but especially in the middle of the neck, you wouldn't be able to fold it like this. Now, sometimes you do see a updated version of this, like in this toy, where it's pretty straight, or at least a pretty gentle curve, but it's this dramatic low slung posture. But work in 2021 reconstructed how the neck would have habitually been held, and it's not like that. It's pretty much straight out, though with the head angled down because of the shape of the back of the skull. The skull of Lawsoni made it to publication in 1996, though at the time it obviously wasn't called Lawsoni. Meanwhile, collection at Big Bend, of pterosaurs anyway, seems to have wound down. Workers were still visiting the site almost annually, usually Langston or another fellow named Thomas Lehman, but they really only found a few isolated fragments, the last of which appears to have been a femur that Lehman found in 2002. This is in fact the last pterosaur material recovered from Big Bend at time of writing. It's kind of poetic. We opened with a giant arm and closed with a giant leg. But in the meantime, Langston had been working on more conventional models than the ornithopter, both to study the animal's biomechanics, you know, how do the joints actually work, or to put the animal in a wind tunnel and see what its aerodynamics do. None of that seems to have made it to publication. He was also working on descriptions of the material this whole time, but again, none of it made it to publication before Langston passed away in 2013, and none of those manuscripts have survived just due to the vagaries of digital works in progress, which is understandable. But then, in the late 2010s, workers got together and said, we can't let all this work go to waste. And they put together this massive collection of papers that were published in 2021 as an open access memoir, and that is the source of most of this episode. So thanks for doing that, guys. As you might have guessed from the slightly scattershot collection, these remains are spread out physically and temporally. The youngest remains we have are of an animal that's probably Northropi. It's an isolated neck vertebra. It's in a stream channel deposit, which is the same depositional environment that we find Northropi in, but it is from Pterodactyl Ridge, Black Peaks Formation. Probably contemporary with that are several giant foot bones of an indeterminate Azhdarkid, but those are from a floodplain deposit. Older than that, at the very top of Javelina Formation, is the Northropi holotype, that big wing. There's also a fragmentary left ulna referred to Northropi, and two partial femurs. The right, which is the one I mentioned earlier, and a left, which is the same species as the other femur, but because the Northropi holotype doesn't have any leg bones, we can't be sure that these femurs are actually the same species. The right femur is about the size we would expect for the Northropi holotype, though. There's also a fragmentary right first wing finger bone in between Lawsoni and Northropi in size, but it doesn't share autapomorphies with Northropi, so I don't know what that could be. All these specimens are from stream channel deposits. Below that, and throughout the upper Javelina Formation, is an absurd amount of Lawsoni material, mostly in 4 concentrations. There's 305 elements from 214 specimens. This is by far the most specimens we have of an Azhdarkid, and they're preserved 3-dimensionally in a channel lake deposit where light elements like ribs or dorsal vertebrae got carried away by the water or just scavenged. This doesn't appear to be a nutritional assemblage. You know, these are not animals dying at different times that have all just wound up buried together. This was a whole flock of Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni that were around the same age, they all seemed to be adults, who died at the same time for unknown reasons. And they were buried quickly, before there was too much transport or scavenging or weathering. If it wasn't already clear, these stratigraphic correlations are imprecise. It's possible that there's a succession of lawsoni, then Northropi, then the indeterminate Northropi-like giant, but it's just as likely that these animals all coexisted, and we find them in different depositional environments because they lived in different habitats, or to be more precise, died in different habitats. This is why I keep emphasizing the depositional environment, because it seems like lawsoni preferred lacustrine environments, channel lakes, like oxbow lakes, whereas Northropi seems to have preferred riparian, active streams, or at least the wetlands around them. Surprise, it's an alluvial plain again. The end of the Cretaceous saw the Cretaceous Western Interior Seaway receding, so these vast areas that had been underwater millions of years ago were opening up. So the area we find Quetzalcoatlus in was an inland basin, like 300 to 400 kilometers from what was then the coastline, which admittedly was still closer than the coastline is today. The bodies of water we find Quetzalcoatlus in and around saw intermittent flooding and sedimentation events, followed by periods of colonization by freshwater bugs. There's a rich microfauna of large invertebrates that are living on or in these lake beds because it's well-oxygenated water. Lehman writes that lawsoni, at least, could have been probing for mussels, snails, crustaceans, maybe insects and worms when they were little. If the Amaral bone bed represents a flock that was looking for a place to nest, which we don't know that it was, but it's possible, this would have been a good spot. It's got a lot of little invertebrates to turn into Quetzalcoatlus flappy meals, but the flock died before they could get to that part. As I said, it is from this site, the Amaral site or Pterodactyl Ridge, that we have our only Quetzalcoatlus cranial material. It is missing the tip of the snout and the back of the skull, which I think means that Zhejiangopterus, described in 1994, is actually still our best cranial material from a large Azhdarkid. But because of that gap at the back of the head, there are several credible reconstructions to this day of the shape of whatever crest was going on Quetzalcoatlus. Sometimes you see a segmented structure like this, where it's got a kind of a larger area in front and then a more muted area behind. Sometimes you just have one big mohawk, like this toy. But none of them look like this toy, where it's this rhomboid fin incorporating the tip of the beak. And mind you, whatever the bone was doing, there could have also been soft tissue crests or feathers or both on top of that. This toy's head is too short and its body too long if we're scaling from the humerus. And so compared to ornithochiroids, Azhdarkids seem to have relatively larger bodies. So while this is another pterosaur that has a gigantic head and teeny tiny body, it's not as extreme as what we saw in Pteranodon, but then what is? As of 2021, that giant head comes in two forms. I'm not calling them morphs for historical reasons. These are distinguished by whether they are larger or smaller, whether the main fenestra is tall or squat, whether the shape of the crest is humped or more rounded, and whether the inside of the snout bar dips near the front or not. Now, as you'll notice, aside from the difference in the crest shape, those are all pretty minor differences, and workers acknowledge that those could just be down to individual variation, or ontogeny, or even just preservation. Like, some of them are more battered than the others. But it is also possible that these two skulls of each form represent sexual dimorphism. Time will tell, I suppose. That giant head is mostly air, of course. It both has pneumaticized bone and, more obviously, those giant windows. The whole skull winds up looking like this triangular pyramid. Like other derived pterosaurs, the nares and antorbital fenestrae are combined into one window. We would expect that the nostrils would be at the front of the nasoantorbital fenestra, not the back. And as in dinosaurs, this window is mostly sinuses connecting the external nostrils to the internal nostrils on the roof of the mouth, or maybe nostril. The choanae are also joined together into one opening in the middle of the front of the palatal basket. I don't know what to call this part. The roof of the mouth of this animal is distended, is the term that workers use. The middle of the roof of the mouth is below the edges of the mouth, which is a feature that also shows up in tapeyaurids. As you probably noticed, the whole head is oddly shaped. We don't have the rear, but we presume it was angled like in all derived pterodactyloids, somewhere between 45 and 60 degrees, such that the whole back of the head is tilted down, which means that the eyes are actually in the lower half of the head. Though I suppose that depends on how you look at it. To a Quetzalcoatlus, the back of the head would be straight and the mouth is bent down, I would think. The back of the mouth has this pronounced downward curve, which makes the whole animal look like it's doing a frowny face. The joint of the jaw is pretty robust, which you would expect. I mean, look at the size of the jaw it's holding. Though the musculature of the jaw is relatively weak compared to what we're used to seeing with dinosaurs. This doesn't seem to be an animal that's prioritizing being able to bite down with a lot of force, which is pretty conventional for pterosaurs. In 1996, they reconstructed the maximum gape, while accounting for soft tissues, to be less than 52 degrees, but remember how long those jaws are. That means that Lawsoni could fit a bicycle wheel in its mouth, if it wanted to, and if bicycles had existed at the time. I was surprised to learn from the 2021 description that the occlusal margin, the working edge of the mouth, is actually S-curved. It's got that downward curve at the back, which actually starts pretty far forward. It starts basically where the nasoantorbital fenestra leaves off. But then there's also a gentle upwards or convex curve to the bottom edge of the snout, with a matching curve to the mandible. Meanwhile, the top of the snout is a narrow keel, so in cross-section the rostrum has an upside-down golf tee shape. The keel itself is pretty busted up in every specimen that still has it, but Andres says it's straight all the way to the crest. But, like, after decades of this extremely straight stork-like bill, it is weird to see that slight curve coming into the tip of the snout. And I may as well mention that this toy, with its like lantern jaw, is the exact opposite of what was going on with Quetzalcoatlus. Both the upper and the lower beak, the Rhinotheca and Gnathotheca if you prefer, were tapering to sharp points. A beak it had indeed. The occlusal margin of the mouth has this sharp ridge, at least towards the front. Once you get around 3 centimeters in front of the nasoandarbital fenestra, that leaves off and there's a more rounded edge to the jawbones that might correlate with the like working part of the beak leaving off, and then we have, more pliant tissues beyond that point. Other pterosaurs show the correlates for composite beaks, which is where you have multiple plates of varying hardness for different uses, but we don't have those correlates in Quetzalcoatlus. It's possible that like those kinds of fine grooves that you see on the surface of the bone just don't show up because our preservation is kind of poor, though we do have grooves kind of like that in the roof of the mouth. But even if it had different plates, we wouldn't be able to say where one plate leaves off and the next begins like we can with other animals. Man, a lot of stuff happens just in front of the nasoandarbital fenestra. You've got the sharp edge of the beak leaving off, the back of the mouth starts curving down, the palate goes convex, the nostrils are somewhere around there, and the dentary symphysis ends, which might be where the throat pouch begins. You can actually see the dentary symphysis in this toy. It's where the two sides of the jawbone are joined, and it goes quite a ways back. And usually artists will restore the throat pouch as starting right where that symphysis leaves off. This throat pouch is actually pretty tiny. We know that throat pouches exist in pterosaurs. We have a specimen of Pterodactylus that shows one starting actually pretty far back in the mouth, but then extending down to like the 4th cervical vertebra. And if you reconstruct a throat pouch that extensive on Quetzalcoatlus, you get this volume of pouch that's like comparable to the volume of the rest of the head. But why not? The whole animal is already so weird. So if we try to pull some of this together and notice that we have an animal with relatively weak bite force, despite its very long jaw, parallel mouth edges where there isn't any like overlapping area where there's a sweet spot where it's going to be able to concentrate what force it could produce, and no hook at the front of the beak, no teeth, no pseudo-teeth. This does not appear to be an animal that was good at ripping chunks of flesh off of a carcass. It could maybe probe at a carcass that had already been opened by another animal, to get at those sweet, sweet organs, but that would be opportunistic, not something they're adapted for, which is contrary to the initial reconstructions of their ecology. Initially, people looked at these long beaks and these long necks and thought, oh, these are perfect for sticking their whole neck and head into these giant Alamosaurus carcasses that they lived alongside. That's what these guys are. These are enormous vultures. No, they're not. If we want to know what it was doing, well, look at how its limbs are proportioned. Contrary to how this toy portrays it, it was able to take long, relatively efficient strides with those long limbs. It would be standing with its stiff neck relatively horizontal. It would have had its head angled down. It can reach a very wide area, a wide volume, with that long neck and its long head. This is a terrestrial stalker of small prey. Storks are the living analog that workers will tend to point to. Now, storks will sometimes specialize for particular prey. Quetzalcoatlus doesn't seem to have done so. Quetzalcoatlus couldn't grab anything large enough to put up a fight. It didn't have big loppers on its face like its contemporary Wellnhopterus. Unusually for an Azhdarchid, it doesn't have nutrient foramina on its jaws. Those have been correlated in other animals with the sensory organs you need for tactile feeding, like probing or fishing. It just has general purpose chopsticks on its face. It's just grabbing whatever it can pick up and swallow. The Lancian faunal stage of North America seems to have had distinct zones for megafauna. You've got Triceratops in the north and Alamosaurus in the south, but for the little guys, which Quetzalcoatlus is interested in, they're fairly similar all over, which is why I was surprised to learn that much of the fauna of the underlying Aguja Formation doesn't actually carry over into Javelina. This might be a consequence of Aguja being more coastal. The ocean was closer in those days, whereas Javelina is more high and dry. As we might expect, given that sauropods live here, we have some big old trees, mostly Javelinoxylon. these are represented by logs 40 to 80 centimeters across, which suggests trees 30 meters high or more, with slightly buttressed trunks and roots. Now, we primarily find them around the stream deposits, whereas the lakes seem to have been in clearings, but this is a mature angiosperm forest forming a closed canopy. This is not a flora that is colonization plants after a disaster. It's matured. Other trees are rarer, but we do have some other angiosperm trees and Araucarian conifers, which are apparently inescapable. In Javelina Formation rivers and streams, but not in those alkaline abandoned channel lakes where we find Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, we have a variety of fishes, amiids, relatives of bowfins, and seemingly more than one species of gar. It would make sense to find big salamanders here, like Uptus the Triton or Hadrosaurus, or even some freshwater skates or rays, but none of those are known from Javelina. We do have one or more species of soft-shell turtles known from shell fragments, and another turtle that may or may not be Basilemus, which is a big old turtle. Lehman mentions that mammals are present. This appears to mean isolated teeth. From context, we would expect eukosmodontid and tylodontoid multituberculates and maybe alphodon, so roughly mouse-like, squirrel-like, and possum-like mammals, respectively. As far as competition goes, we mostly have other Azhdarkids. Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni, Northropi, that other giant that may or may not be Northropi, and that indeterminate small Azhdarkid, as well as Wellnopterus. We have a few crocodilians known from teeth. One seems to be similar to Brachychampsa, which is a pretty close relative to modern alligators. And like their modern counterpart, these were semi-aquatic ambush predators. We have, quote, several small theropods with, quote, limited material, which is vague, but I would expect that these are either parave teeth or Oviraptorosaur fragments, both of which we find plenty of in Aguja. So tentatively, we would expect mid-sized troodontids and or largish eudromaeosaurs and or largish canignathids. But that is only a guess. I mention these mostly because the size of prey that Maniraptors would be taking overlaps with Quetzalcoatlus's food supply. Which is not the case for the top terrestrial predator from Javelina, Tyrannosaurus. At least there is a subadult maxilla, an adult tailbone, and an undescribed right foot that are most probably Tyrannosaurus. As adults, those would have been devoting their energy to the hadrosaurs Cretosaurus, a solid-crested saurolophine, and a flat-headed saurolophine, which could be a species of Gryposaurus, and the ceratopsids, Bravoceratops and Torosaurus. Now, as with lawsoni and Northropi, it's possible that there was a succession here, with Cretosaurus, the solid-crested animal, and Bravoceratops early on, and then Gryposaurus and Torosaurus replacing them, but the remains are rare enough that we can't be certain that that's the case. There are ankylosaur remains, but I don't know anything more. Older publications will list these as nodosaurids, so it sounds like these might be armor fragments, or they might be teeth. Really, this formation is Alamosaurus' show. It dominated the ecosystem in life and the faunal assemblage in death. This was a giant titanosaur, 25 meters long or more. Half of the Javelina megafauna we've found, going by minimum number of individuals, are Alamosaurus, though another quarter are Quetzalcoatlus. Much has been written about ontogenetic niche shifting, where we have these fossil ecosystems with little guys like the Maniraptors and giants like the Tyrannosaurs, but seemingly no middle ground. And a pattern emerges where the juveniles of large, fast-growing megatheropods occupied roles that would otherwise go to different mid-sized animals. But this research has primarily focused on terrestrial, non-flying animals, which does make sense in the early Cretaceous, but by the late Cretaceous, we might expect some of those mid-sized roles to be filled by the giant Azhdarkids. I am very curious to know what impact on community structure our friendly neighborhood giraffe storks were having, because it must have been something, right? Problem is, to look into that, we would need the remains to preserve better than they do. We want information on their growth and their survivorship, which is lacking. As I said, in some ways we have a very good sample of Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni. We have multiple elements from many individuals preserved in 3 dimensions. But in other ways it's a poor sample because they all died at the same age, so we don't have individuals of different ages represented. So it's tempting when restoring Northropi to simply scale up the much better known lawsoni until it's the size of the bones we have from Northropi. The problem is we know that it would be proportioned somewhat different. If broad pterodactyloid trends hold, we might expect that the outboard wing would be even shorter, but with possibly slightly longer hand and thigh bones. This is a concern because Quetzalcoatlus northropi is famous for being the largest pterosaur, but exactly what wingspan that indicates has been harder to pin down. By Andres's count, there have been more than 50 wingspan estimates for Northropi since 1972, and they mostly cluster into people with their hands on the material who say, well, if it was proportioned like these very similar animals, we think it would be roughly around this size. And then there's other people who are like, well, I think it was proportioned like a bird. And that's where we get our wilder estimates. The lowest is 5.25 meters, which was just taking the humerus and then calculating what the rest of the wing would be like based on birds. Lawson himself initially reconstructed the wingspan as very large, 15.5 meters in 1972. This is the reconstruction that appeared on the cover of Science in 1975, shown in comparison to a pteranodon, a condor, and the Northrop YB-49 bomber, which explains why Lawson chose the specific name Northropi. He was definitely envisioning the animal as a flying wing. Lawson explained that the 15.5 meter estimate was based on allometric scaling of what we call Lawsoni, with the gaps estimated based on Zungaripterus and Pteranodon. But he also upped the ante and pointed out that if general trends of pterodactyloid proportions hold, the wingspan could be 21 meters. Similar reasoning to that got us our largest estimate ever, 25.8 meters, which is based on what is now Aurora Azhdarco, which despite the name is actually a Tenokosmatoid. It was a mistake to let the Germans name pterosaur stuff. They're not afraid of syllables. But that wasn't actually a serious reconstruction. They were trying to highlight the problem with making these kinds of extrapolations for pterosaurs, because using different animals as your baseline will mean your allometry, your calculation about how different parts of the animal grow faster or slower than others, will get thrown way off. Which is a particular problem for Quetzalcoatlus, because at the time that Brown and Venus were writing, we didn't have any other good remains from pterosaurs that even approach its size. So the problem of having an animal that is very differently proportioned and extrapolating that to a giant just magnifies the problem accordingly. So, for example, if we reconstruct Northropi based on the Tapayarid Cyanopterus, the elongation of the inboard finger bones more than makes up for the shortening of the outboard ones. Whereas, if we make it grow like Pteranodon, all the finger bones are shorter, so overall the wing is shorter. But you'll notice that difference is like a foot. But also, as some of you may have already noticed, we don't even know if Lawsoni is a good starting point, is a good proxy for an immature Quetzalcoatlus Northropi. Like as not, they were pretty similar as flaplings, but then diverged as Northropi grew to gigantic size and Lawsoni grew to only large size. Andres stepped around this problem and used phylogeny directly. He said that, well, these are the proportions of the animal that Quetzalcoatlus, Northropi, and Lawsoni evolved from, so their bones would have been starting from this baseline. This is called ancestral state reconstruction, and it's as good a guide as we're going to get in the absence of Azhdarkid juvies. Okay, why am I griping about this so much? It's because we do know how one part of the Azhdarkid body grew, and it is indeed quite different from what we see in other pterosaurs. It's the head and the neck. See, in all other long-necked pterosaurs, possibly all other long-necked tetrapods, you see strong positive allometry in the head and the neck. The larger the animal gets, the head and the neck get even longer. But if you apply that growth to Northropi, you wind up with a 5-meter neck or more and 3 or 4 meters of head, which is twice the size that it would be if it was isometric, which are impossible. Naish and Witten worked out that as Azhdarkids increase in size, vertebra 4 does get slightly longer than isometry, but all the rest are slightly to substantially shorter. The overall effect is very slight negative allometry. This is because, unlike other giant long necks, for example the sauropods, Azhdarkids are under some pretty specific constraints. They have that giant head and those very thin-walled neck vertebrae. So even though the pneumatization permits larger diameter, which gives them more strength per weight, they would still hit a point where the bones buckle if they enlarge the way that smaller pterosaurs do. Hatzegopteryx actually takes this even further. It has these short, broad, thick-walled vertebrae, which result in an overall shorter but also more flexible neck for an Azhdarkid, which is better able to bear the stresses of macropredation, which was Hatzegopteryx's niche. Whereas Quetzalcoatlus and Aurumbourgiania are pretty much the opposite. Their walls stay thin, but they keep the radius of the neck very tight. So they have these long, thin, light, but relatively stiff necks. They can't take as high of loads and stresses, but they don't need to. They're just snapping up small critters. and the length expands their feeding envelope, which is much more important. Interestingly, at time of writing, there don't seem to be distinct lineages of robust-necked versus gracile-necked Azhdarkids. It's just an adaptation to their lifestyle. Like Welnopterus has those giant jaws, but then a relatively gracile neck. It's almost like we're seeing Darwin's finches, where the beaks are changing form, but like the beak is the size of a person. As we might expect from such fragmentary material, the phylogeny of Azhdarkids shuffles around a little bit. Quetzalcoatlus is consistently recovered closely related to Aurumborgiania from Jordan and Hatzegopteryx from Romania, and more recently to Cryodracon from Canada. The rest of the family is either this forked arrangement with Quetzalcoatlines, animals closer to Quetzalcoatlus, and Azhdarkines, animals closer to Azhdarco from Uzbekistan. Or it's this lopsided stem and branch deal with the Azhdarkines broken up into roughly successive outgroups of Quetzalcoatlus. Which of these is true seems to depend on whether Mistral Azhdarco from France and Aerotitan from Argentina are more closely related to Quetzalcoatlus or to Azhdarco. I'm listing the countries for all of these to emphasize the global distribution of these closely related animals, which does make sense for flying creatures. We're not going to see the kind of endemism we see with terrestrial dinosaurs, but it is weird to me personally because I'm usually researching those terrestrial dinosaurs. In Quetzalcoatlus's time, the Maastrichtian, we have Azhdarkids from Montana, Wyoming, Texas, Morocco, Spain, France, Romania, Jordan, and Mongolia. And even more if we go further back into the Cretaceous, so clearly this was a successful, globally distributed group. Now, you may be wondering why they're called Azhdarkids if Azhdarco wasn't named until 1984 and Quetzalcoatlus was named in 75. Shouldn't we call these Quetzalcoatlids or maybe Aurumborgianiids? I'm glad I imagined you asking that because these are two interwoven issues here. The first is that Quetzalcoatlus sort of wasn't named this whole time. Until 2021, it was technically a nomen nudum. So in 72, Lawson called it Pteranodon gigas, but that was in a thesis that didn't actually meet the criteria for publication for a new taxon. Not that it mattered, because in 75 he recognized that, oh, this isn't genus Pteranodon at all. Lawson called it Quetzalcoatlus northropi in a letter published in 1975, which is actually an interesting artifact, and we will come back to it, but he didn't actually diagnose it in that publication. Lawson was working on a proper diagnosis, but for various reasons that never made it to print. There were other workers trying to resolve this in 91 and 2014, but for reasons that only matter to nomenclature wonks, those didn't take either. Then finally, related to the collection of papers that was going to be published finally describing the animal, in 2017 there was a proposal to the ICZN to retroactively just make Lawson's name count, and in 2019 that was approved. So effectively, Quetzalcoatlus was sort of common law married to this specimen the whole time, but it didn't have the paperwork. Now, the name thing, while interesting to some of us, is not actually as important as the lack of a diagnosis, because it meant in the interim that if you wanted to be able to say what is and is not a Quetzalcoatlus trait, for instance, if you're trying to construct a phylogeny, you have a really hard time actually doing that. So things stood in 1984, which admittedly was when some of Quetzalcoatlus was still in the ground, when two workers, half a world away from one another, independently noticed that we have all these giant late Cretaceous pterosaurs with these distinctive neck vertebrae that seem to form a natural group. Nesov based his group on Azhdarco from Uzbekistan, whereas Attn based his on Titanopteryx from Syria. But that name was actually preoccupied by some flies, of course, so they had to change the name of the genus to Aurumborgiania. But before that happened, Attn had recognized that both he and Nesov had erected a similar group based on the same character and acknowledged that Nesov's paper came out first, so his name takes precedence, though it had to be elevated to the appropriate rank. Which works out anyway because Azhdarco has much more material than Aurumborgiania, and crucially, Azhdarkids is a much cooler name than Titanopterygids. As I said, as animals spending a lot of time striding along on the ground, they lengthened the walking portion of their limb at the expense of the finger portion. This toy's wings correctly have relatively short fingers, but it overdoes it. It's really only the outer wing phalanges, the outer finger bones, that are super short. The first one is still pretty long. About half the length of the wing is just arm and hand. Exactly what that means for the animal's flight mechanics does require some legwork, no pun intended. As far as I know, the first 3 fingers of the hand would be palm forward when the animal's in flight, or maybe slightly ventrally deflected, but it would not have this, like, secondary wrist that most of these toys have. The metacarpals stay close to the big wing metacarpal. This toy also portrays very little muscle on the bones. It's true that overall their arms were these slender, wiry things, but there was muscle there, and there was a soft tissue wedge of fibrous tissues surrounding an air pocket around the bones, creating this like fairing. And that would have been fairly deep in the proximal part of the arm. They were not just fuzzy twigs. Actually, all of these toys, with the exception of our lovely Moldorama, seem to portray the fuzz, the pycnofibers or protofeathers or whatever term you want to use, extending all the way to the tip of the wing. And I don't know how reasonable that is. Like other pterosaurs, we don't know if these animals would have had any scales on their bodies aside from some tuberculate stuff on the soles of their feet, seemingly for traction. I assume this would also be the case for the hands that they're walking on. You know, the palms of the hands would have grip, but we don't have tracks from an Azhdarkid that preserve with the level of detail that we would need to be able to say that for sure. We do have Azhdarkid tracks from the Santonian Campanian of Korea that show an animal smaller than Quetzalcoatlus walking on a muddy substrate, so presumably this is somewhat similar to Northrop I's habitat. An interesting detail is that the toes and the claws of these tracks are not clearly distinguishable, so the authors think this is evidence that they had webbed fingers and toes. Now, does that mean that all Azhdarkids had webbed fingers and toes? We don't know. It's a single data point, but it is suggestive. Those tracks also corroborate that there were substantial pads on the toes and heel of the feet, and presumably on the hand as well, though that's only an educated guess. This is similar to what we see in Tapajarids, which have a beautifully preserved specimen with the heel pad intact. Now, if, as seems increasingly likely, feathery integument was ancestral to Ava metatarsalia, we might expect some secondarily feather-derived structures on some parts of the animal. This toy shows bird-like scutes on the hands and the toes, which is, as far as I know, reasonable, but what little unfeathered skin we have shows glabrous skin, like ours, bald skin. I don't know why I used the term glabrous, that's just a technical thing. Anyway, the feathery coat was pretty extensive. Based on other animals, we would expect the face, neck, body, tail, and upper limbs to all be covered, probably mostly by simple hair-like filaments called pycnofibers, a few centimeters long. This was probably longer in a few places, like concave parts of the body, like behind the head or maybe in the armpit or whatever. Like the overall effect would be to smooth the contour of the animal. Whereas in both of these toys, the feathery integument does almost nothing to obscure the muscular, tightly skinned physique, which is probably not the case. We have a variety of protofeather types known in pterosaurs. In Neuragnathids, we have these tufted feathers that look like bushes on varying lengths of stem. And in Tupandactylus, we have both simple filaments and these short feathers that are branched along most of their length. As far as I know, that's the closest relative to Quetzalcoatlus with fluff preserved. Interestingly, on average, the more complex feathers are much shorter than the simple filaments, and they don't seem to mix. We have different kinds of feathers on different parts of the animal. This is as opposed to like what we see in mammals, where you'll have an undercoat and guard hairs. So it's possible Quetzalcoatlus had any manner of exotic feathery doodads. Maybe that short little tail had bristles or long strap-like decorations. Maybe the head crest had decorative bushy things like Tupandactylus. Go nuts! Though do be mindful of aerodynamic drag. The one feather type we don't find in pterosaurs is the Maniraptoran interlocked barbule veined feather, where the entire coat can form this nice, smooth casing around the animal's body. I was trying to get to a point about the extent of the feathering, wasn't I? So this toy, and to a lesser extent this toy, have the feathering extend all the way to the wingtips and the ankles. Our only good guide for this is actually Neuragnathids again. They show that the feathering stops at the elbow and the knee. And Eurygnathids are so much more basal and smaller than an Azhdarchid. I don't think it's unreasonable to have the pelage, the coat, extend further than it does in those little guys. I also don't know to what extent having the coat all the way to the wingtip would present a challenge for flight, or maybe it would make dealing with parasites more of a problem. I don't know what selection pressures we're really working with here. Other than feathers present unique opportunities for display structures because they can present colors that the bald skin can't. So maybe that was the most important function of the feathers, we just don't know. Considering the insultingly pleasant climate they were living in, I don't know if insulation from heat or cold was particularly important to these animals. Maybe if it climbed to high altitudes, but in that case it would probably be shedding a lot of heat from its wing membrane. Frey, Tischinger, and co-authors looked at the way that blood vessels run throughout the wing membrane and speculated that if it could constrict those vessels, it could actually keep most of its blood concentrated in the torso and the proximal limbs, where there's much more insulation. I haven't found a follow-up actually modeling that, but I can say that they probably would need insulation from the sun. Since they don't have scales protecting their bald skin, they would require that the feathering just shields them the way that our hair shields our head. By the same token, you might expect that the bald skin might be more melanized, since melanin protects against UV radiation. Alternatively, being that these are reptiles, they might have had some kind of natural sunscreen secretion either in or on their skin. They probably retained the ability to synthesize these chemicals called gadussols, which are much more protective against UV than melanin is anyway, but it's not as useful for our purposes because gadussols don't seem to affect the appearance of the animal. Unless you can see UV, I suppose. Now you might say, well, couldn't it just stay out of the sun? Well, sure, but I will point out that the warm updrafts that it seems to have relied on for extended flight would only be able to form in the heat of the afternoon. Though it is also possible that they were only occasional flyers, in which case they could have been active whenever. Both of these toys have their torsos stuck in the 1980s. Popular science depictions of Quetzalcoatlus in that period, pterosaurs generally, really, had these broad almond-shaped or pancake torsos, whereas it should be much more of a compact capsule. Now, weirdly, despite this toy's broad pancake, you can actually see through the fuzz and the muscle where the shoulders are articulating with the spine, which doesn't make any sense. The shoulders were probably the widest point of the torso. This toy has the humeri both extremely under-muscled and also seemingly articulating with the spine. In actuality, there was a hoop of bones girding the torso, consisting of the cristospine, which is the crest on the bottom of the front of the breastbone, the coracoids, and the shoulder blades, and the notarium. This is the load-bearing fusion of vertebrae neural spines where the shoulder blades meet. It's sort of like a sacrum, but for the shoulder. It also shows up in birds. But this hoop, the pectoral girdle, ensures that the torso can take the stresses of flight without crumpling. And the two halves of that hoop actually hinge. The scapulae have this rounded tip where they articulate with the notarium, and the coracoids have this saddle joint that fits onto the cristospine. The point is, the whole thing can move a little bit, even when it's packed with muscle, which would probably restrict that movement. They have muscles running from the neck to the shoulder blade, a lot like ours, and obviously they have their flight muscles, being flying animals. Overall, it had about 10 degrees of range of motion, and could have been one way that the animal controls its pitch stability. It could have also had a suspension effect by letting the springy parts of the musculoskeletal system absorb some of the stresses of the flight stroke. So how do we know that these toys are under-muscled compared to this toy? And honestly, this toy might be underselling it a bit too, since you can still see the spine poking out. Well, partially it's that the arm bones have these broad surfaces for joining to their neighbors, which implies that during flight they were taking significant amounts of force. More directly, we have enlarged crests on both the arm bones and the pectoral girdle, showing that, oh yeah, the muscles that were attaching here must have been enormous. Particularly, the deltopectoral crest on the humerus in Northropi could split logs. And we have these long, more rounded crests on the scapula for the upstroke muscles and on the coracoid for the downstroke muscles. So you wouldn't have this sharp keel like this toy portrays. It would just be one big rounded mass of muscle. Now, like other derived pterosaurs and like birds, the anterior ribs were also rigidly attached. This is similar to the purpose of the shoulder hoop. It keeps the torso from buckling under the forces of flight, but it also means that whatever breathing they were doing had to be done with just pumping the belly ribs and maybe the last few ribs. That said, most of the animal is filling with air or moving air around. In addition to the lungs, where the oxygen is exchanged, they have air sacs or diverticula in the head, neck, abdomen, the belly probably, the wings, at least as far as the first wing finger bone, and even the thighs. In addition to the weight saving, this also allows the animal to use unidirectional flow-through breathing. Like other archosaurs, instead of filling their lungs and emptying their lungs the way we do, they could move fresh air through the lung both while inhaling and exhaling, even passively. Attn and co-authors hint at an idea that as the two halves of the shoulder girdle rock during flapping, it would be opening and closing a bellows. This is similar to the gular pumping in crocodiles, so even if they're not actively breathing, just the action of flapping could maybe move a little bit of air through. But then they hit us with, this is beyond the scope of the present paper, so we'll have to wait and see how that actually works, or if that actually works. At the other end of this absurdly short torso that this animal had are the legs. There are pterosaurs with long necks, and there are pterosaurs with long legs, but only Azhdarkids do both. I was prepared to say that the legs of this toy are too short, but if we follow the precedent of scaling from the humerus, these are actually pretty well proportioned. They're just also bent and postured in a way that it could not. Also, the feet are much too wide, and I'm not sure what this toy's fifth toe is doing. In pterodactyloids, the fifth toe is very short. In Quetzalcoatlus, it's just this little stub. It might not even have, like, a toe worthy of the name on it. The feet and toes are quite slender. They're plenty strong. It's just like the rest of the leg, compared to the wing, they wind up looking rather frail and wafy. As animals that are spending a lot of time striding along the ground, having long legs means that even with those long arms of yours, your body is going to stay relatively horizontal, which means that using your neck to feed from a large envelope works better. Again, it's all about being able to get those face tongs around. There really are two keys that just make the rest of this animal's anatomy fall into place, one of which is the terrestrial stalker model. The other is quadrupedal launch. Both of them together show how an animal with these very long legs for moving around on the ground could still be able to take off and fly if it had to. Which is the reason I keep bringing everything back to how it moved around on the ground, even though there's way more literature talking about how these animals flew. We know from that trackway in the Ohangri Formation that portrayals like this toy, although maybe this is supposed to be threatening or something, when the animal is just standing around, walking around, it is much more upright than this. They do have slightly sprawled limbs, they are not dinosaurs, but the movement of their limbs on the ground is parasagittal, is moving front to back. The advantage of this is that it is a very energy-saving way to stand and walk, but it also means that if you're looking at the animal from the front or the back, it would look so narrow. The handprints are slightly outboard of the footprints in those trackways, so the arms would be slightly more sprawled than the legs, but it is minor. One odd feature of the tracks is that the footprint is in front of the nearest handprint. And keep in mind that unlike in this toy, and actually they got this right in the Moldorama, when it's on the ground, the hand is basically backwards or slightly outwards. What it means is these animals were walking kind of like a camel, in that it would pick up the left hand and foot and move them together, then pick up the right hand and foot and move those together. With this gait, the foot winds up in front of where the ipsilateral hand had just been, which does make sense for such long-limbed creatures, especially with the membrane connecting the arm and the leg, though obviously on the ground that would have been slack, so I don't actually know how much of a constraint that is. The Manus and Pez prints, the hand and foot prints, are also roughly the same depth, which is different from what we see in other pterosaurs where the hand prints are distinctly deeper. And we don't know the proportions of the Uhangri Formation track maker. Like, we know that heads and necks could vary a lot in Azhdarkids, so maybe Quetzalcoatlus had much deeper handprints than footprints, or vice versa. But what is safe to say is that when these animals were on the ground, the arms and the legs were working in concert, including when it was time to take off. Historically, reconstructions of takeoff in Quetzalcoatlus, and all pterosaurs for that matter, is basically like birds. They either run or jump with the hind limbs while flapping with the forelimbs. In contrast, the quad launch model, developed in the early 2000s by Habib, Cunningham, Molnar, and some others, proposes that pterosaurs would sort of handspring into the air using all four limbs for propulsion. This is similar, superficially, to the way certain bats take off, or the way that some birds will take off from the surface of the water. The animal uses its hind limbs essentially just for the forward push, and jumps using their much more powerful forelimbs. This provides an elegant solution for why such giant heavy flyers don't have hind limbs that are as jacked as their forelimbs. Which is a relative statement. Their legs were still plenty strong. In fact, so Quetzalcoatlus's pelvic material is actually not that well preserved. It's crushed and somewhat fragmentary, but from other Azhdarchoids we know that they had these processes both fore and aft of the hip joint. And the rear one might have been a workaround for their needing much stronger leg retractor muscles, but having this honestly pathetic little tail. You're not going to anchor a caudofemoralis longus to that in order to pull your leg back. So they anchor their muscles to that hook on the pelvis, the post-acetabular process of the ilium, which in Quetzalcoatlus is it's actually more of a T-shape than a hook, but it's the largest that we have found in any pterosaur. The point is they definitely had power in their hind limbs, but it pales in comparison to what they could produce with their arms. Now, the 2021 functional morphology paper that we've referred to a few times now checked the range of motion of the joints of the animal to test these ideas about how they moved, both the terrestrial locomotion and the quad launch. And there was actually a difference of opinion between the co-authors as to whether the quad launch or the more conventional bird-like leap was more reasonable. Both are within the range of motion of the animal, though it also kind of depends on how you're reconstructing the musculature and tendons around the hip. There's actually a new method for checking this. You can use 3D software to run through every possible configuration of a joint and even adjust for different amounts of cartilage or different stretchiness of the ligaments and tendons. And workers did this for Anhanguera. And they found some difficulties with the bipedal launch that the quad launch just didn't have. And I really hope somebody applies this method to an Azhdarchid before long, and that we get quantitative research on how much torsional stress the bones could take. Previous research has emphasized that the arms can take much more bending than the legs could, which would imply that quad launch would be preferable, but does that apply to Quetzalcoatlus? Don't know yet. I also hope we get a quantitative look at how much force the muscles could actually produce. I hope all of these things, because the Padian and co-authors paper leaves me with more questions than it answers, if I'm being honest. They came up with a very different gait for these animals when they're on the ground, unique among tetrapods by their own admission. They have this crouched hind limb so that it has to take more steps just to hit the same pace as the gait with the legs extended. It's this sort of slinking quasi-bipedal shuffle where it's only briefly putting its hands on the ground. They compare the forelimbs to walking sticks. They're not contributing to the forward propulsion of the animal at all. That last part is based on the disturbance or lack thereof of the substrate of some handprints in a beautiful trackway from Craysac in France. But that is a much more basal Jurassic pterodactyloid than Quetzalcoatlus, and there's no mention of the Uhangri Formation trackways at all. But in those much smaller animals, the dirt is not disturbed the way it would be if it was pushing off the ground with its hand. Now, that part at least is consistent with some other pterodactyloids like Nyctosaurus or certain ornithochiroids, where their arms are way, way longer than their legs. So when we're reconstructing how they move on the ground, yeah, they're not actually able to use their forelimbs and hind limbs in concert. It's just too much of a geometry problem. Whereas in an Azhdarchid, their hind limbs are much, much longer. They're almost the same length as the forelimbs. the justification for this is that the range of motion of the joints of the forelimb don't permit the amount of swing that it would need to be able to walk in the like camel-like gait. But that's a consequence of the way that you've postured it. Okay, both the bipedal leap and the walking stick gait have something in common. It's this idea that when the animal's on the ground, the hind limbs are much, much more important than the forelimbs. I'm going to talk about this more at the end of the video, but I think they are employing a dated bird-like partitioning of limb function where when the animal's on the ground, it's using the hind limbs, and when it's in the air, it's using the forelimbs. And when it's doing either of those things, the other set is folded up out of the way, or at most passively stabilizing it. And I don't think pterosaurs worked that way. Most pterosaurs don't seem to have had that distinction at all. They're using their forelimbs just as much as their hind limbs when they're moving on the ground, and in the air, they're using their hind limbs to stabilize their airfoil and shape the way the air current moves across it. There's this weird insistence from some corners that like the ancestral pterosaur was bipedal, which we know they weren't because we have trackways of non-pterodactyloids from Craysac, some of them. And even if they had been, having a bipedal ancestor need not constrain the way you, a quadrupedal animal, move. It's kind of weird that they have the hind limb so strongly crouched. You know, they're reconstructing the hind limb as doing most of the work when it's walking, but then they show it doing so in a very energetically costly way. They compare the hind limb to dinosaur hind limbs, and obviously they are similar. They're avimetatarsalians, it's in the name, but some of the comparisons seem inappropriate to me. They compare the curvature of the femur to what we see in ratites, and it's true that there is a correlation between animals that stand more crouched will have a curved femur, and animals that stand more columnar will have a straight femur, but that correlation doesn't hold as strongly for flying animals. They point to the long foot as evidence of running and jumping ability, and also reconstruct the foot much longer than anybody else does. And I'm not disputing that the animal could move, but if you want to look at a limb with traits that correlate with cursoriality, they do have limbs with hinge-like joints, proximal limb elements that are short and massive, distal elements that are long and slender, a digitigrade stance, a single load-bearing metapodial with a large proximal contact, robust phalanges, again with broad proximal contacts. It's the forelimb. I'm talking about the forelimb. Does that sound like a walking stick to you? For the record, I am not suggesting that Quetzalcoatlus had a running adapted forelimb, at least not any more than any other Azhdarkid, but if you are going to use those lines of evidence, be fair about it. Though it does have features that wouldn't hurt. Like, I keep mentioning that it could take nice long strides. That's mostly due to the elongation of the forelimb and the hand. There's these large epicondyles on either side of the elbow end of the humerus that are where the muscles for flexing and extending the wrist attach that suggests that it would be standing and moving relatively upright, relatively parasagittally. The first phalanx of the third finger is this large blackjack-looking thing that appears to be load-bearing. It looks like when the animal is standing on the ground, the wing metacarpal would be like sitting on it. It's sort of like a heel. There are other characteristics of the forelimb that are not so useful on the ground. The radius and the ulna are both really constricted in the middle, like cartoonishly so in Northropi, and the angle of the joints, like the tilt of the articulations, is not great for taking the stresses of walking or running. There's also this kink in the hand bone, metacarpal 4, that shows up in a less pronounced way in other pterosaurs. It's a consequence of needing a slight curve to the wing here because it helps with pitch stability, keeping the wing from passively pronating. But when the animal's on the ground, it means that the knuckles are moved inwards from where they would be if the hand bone were straight. And according to Attn and co-authors, because of this, the wing will fold with the wing finger tucked under the elbow. I've never seen a pterosaur wing fold this way before. Conventionally, you would expect that the wing finger would deflect outwards, actually like this toy, because of the shape of the joint between the first finger bone and the hand. I guess with the wing membrane slack, it wouldn't get in the way of this folding this way. It's just another weird thing about the way these authors reconstruct it standing and moving on the ground. I probably seem like I'm down on this paper. I'm not. It's just we finally got the functional morphology paper about Quetzalcoatlus now that the material has been described, and they introduce all these questions that we now have to find answers for. One thing they do put to bed, though, is the posture of this toy, and actually this toy too, where the legs in flight are straight back with the bottoms of the feet pointed upwards, range of motion of the animal does not permit them to hold their legs that way. As far as what posture the leg did have in flight, well, that depends on how we reconstruct the muscles and ligaments of the leg, and especially how we reconstruct the wing membrane. It was fairly common, especially before the 21st century, to see several different shapes of wing membrane for these guys. You can almost track what decade a depiction is by whether the rear attachment is at the ankle in the 70s, at the hip or the tail with the leg free in the 80s, or at the knee in the late 90s, though there is considerable overlap. Depictions with the legs free often also exclude the uropatagium that runs between the ankle and the hip. They'll usually have the legs folded bird-like, or they might have the legs extended straight back, though I couldn't actually find any artistic depictions like this toy, with the legs extended straight back, but the attachment is at the knee or thereabouts. This toy actually does have a tiny uropatagium, but it's attached to the tail, which, as I understand it, would not happen. It would run from ankle to hip. It's definitely not one continuous membrane like we see in some very basal pterosaurs. The extent of the big membrane, the brachiopatagium, is a much more impactful consideration because it completely changes the plan form of the animal. Every pterosaur that preserves evidence of the attachment point of the membrane has it attaching at the ankle. This creates a very long cord near the animal's body. What shape did the wing membrane take beyond that? Well, that depends on your modeling. The pterosaurs didn't have the common decency to die and be buried in an outstretched soaring posture. We have another spectrum here. You could have a straight shot of the trailing edge of the membrane going directly from the ankle to the wingtip. Under tension, this would create a concave rear edge, potentially strongly concave, but depending on your limb posture, this can look like a giant kite. More on that in a bit. Alternatively, you could have an interior corner, where the actinopatagium is very narrow front to back, and the tenopatagium is very narrow side to side. This creates a very high aspect ratio wing, even with a leg or ankle attachment. But as far as knee versus ankle, I don't know if anybody's actually published this argument, but Azhdarkid thighs are so long that you potentially get the same spar from just the femur that other pterosaurs would need the entire hind limb to get. I blew right past reconstructions that don't attach the membrane to the legs at all. That's because an analysis of pterosaur airfoils suggests indirectly that an animal that had the membrane attached that way would pitch forward and crash. So to answer a question about the legs, we need to look at the arms. When considering the posture of the wings in flight, we need to consider the center of mass and the center of lift, both up and down and front to back. Unlike birds and bats, some pterosaurs, Quetzalcoatlus included, don't have their shoulder joint, the glenoid, up at the top of the torso. It's actually down by the midline. This means that with the wings straight out, the center of mass is at the same height as the center of lift. This makes them more maneuverable, but also means that stable level flight is harder because it's not being passively stabilized by its own mass. Which, with the caveat that a pterosaur is not an airplane, would suggest that when these animals were just cruising along, assuming that's something they did, they would have been holding their wings up instead of straight out. Okay, as far as the rostral-caudal axis, historically, and in anatomical diagrams, and in this toy, it's common to portray a flying pterosaur with its wings straight out. I talked about in the Pteranodon archive that some workers determined that sweeping the wings forward would move the center of lift forward enough that the center of mass of the animal would be supported. Now, how far you need to sweep the wings so that the animal isn't constantly fighting to keep its nose up depends on the anatomy of the creature, and Palmer and Dyke did not model an Azhdarkid. I hope someone does, because unlike Pteranodon, Azhdarkids have their giant heads on the ends of very long necks, which means that even though it's pneumaticized and mostly air, that's still a substantial portion of the animal's mass way out in front of the glenoid. So in order to do what they did and reach a point where the center of lift is lined up with the center of mass, you have to sweep the wings pretty far forward. Okay, I promised this would eventually explain why I'm disregarding the membrane not attaching to the leg. So a consequence of the way that the membrane interacts with the angle between the leg, the body, and the arm is that the camber of the membrane actually flips. In the outboard wing, the cross-section of the flight surface is that familiar arch shape, but on the inboard wing, it's actually S-curved. In aeronautics, this is called reflex camber. it offers higher stability, particularly pitch stability, which is needed with those forward swept wings. And it might go a ways towards explaining how these animals were able to fly without tails. Okay, caveat to all of this is that the center of lift and center of mass in a flapping animal move around constantly. So there's limits to how well airplane math can actually guide us on this. I also wonder how much or how little the propatagium might have helped with this, because conventionally the propatagium is reconstructed like in this toy. I don't like the way that they folded it, but they are showing the pteroid bone to the deltopectoral crest of the humerus is the extent of the membrane. But we know from a specimen of Pterodactylus that the propatagium ran from knuckles to neck, and Quetzalcoatlus, much more derived, has a much longer neck than that animal. But if it was, say, going to the front of the 7th neck vertebra, that would move the center of lift of the animal anteriorly somewhat. Is that enough to matter? I don't know. Palmer in 2010 reconstructed the propatagium's function as more about controlling drag than about actually producing lift, but somebody fund that research. But one thing I learned from looking into this is that it is very easy to create an anatomically plausible reconstruction of Quetzalcoatlus that nonetheless has terrible performance as an airfoil. This is not because they were bad flyers, this is because flight is hard. I mentioned that mid-80s ornithopter QN, but I left out part of the story. See, after a bunch of successful flights, successful in this case meaning that the detachable tail hit the ground before the ornithopter did, they actually took it to an air show for a public demonstration. Unfortunately, the tail seems to have ejected early, which led to a chain of events that ended in the ornithopter breaking its own neck and tumbling to the ground in front of the spectators. So, for a bunch of people, their introduction to Quetzalcoatlus as an animal was this failure of a lizard bird just crumpling to earth. And that does fit the tone of public perception of Quetzalcoatlus. Almost from the moment the initial description was published, people were questioning whether this animal could fly, usually by comparing it to birds, usually with grossly out of proportion mass or even wingspan estimates. The first of these was Crawford H. Greenwald Sr., who wrote to Science in the aftermath of Lawson's initial as-yet unnamed description of the giant pterosaur from Texas, asking how such huge birds, his word, could possibly fly. It was in Lawson's response to him that he first named Quetzalcoatlus northropi, and insightfully pointed out that while birds can guide us, they can provide us with insights into possible solutions to a common problem, that pterosaurs need not have had the same solutions. And that's kinda where we're still at. Even today, there are so many unknowns about the shape, composition, and performance of the flight membrane, not to mention the mass and metabolism of the animal, that I'm surprised workers have been able to determine anything. This is an area of research that is highly integrative. You have to draw information from multiple disciplines to get anything approaching a complete picture. A picture I will now oversimplify. There's two things we need to know: the mass of the animal and how much power it would need to get that mass airborne and keep that mass airborne. Estimates of Quetzalcoatlus's mass have had an even wider spread than estimates of its wingspan. Lawsoni has largely escaped mistreatment because it's smaller and not as interesting, but estimates for northropi have generally trended upwards over time. They started out at like 30 to 70 kilograms, but have gotten as high as half a ton. Pterosaur mass presents even more problems than estimating dinosaur mass, because no matter how you approach it, you're making inferences based on inferences. If we try to extrapolate mathematical equations from bone measurements, you're relying on its extant relatives having soft tissues in the same ballpark as they have, which is obviously not the case. Volumetric estimates have historically been limited by pterosaur remains being either well-preserved or preserved three-dimensionally. You can approach it from the other direction and start with an animal that you know would be able to fly based on how much lift it's producing per mass, and then say, well, how heavy could it be, and this still works. But that requires that your model accurately reflect the pterosaur airfoil and musculature, and that your model accounts for how it actually propels itself. And both of those have been very difficult to pin down. I'm not saying it's impossible and that no one knows anything, I'm just saying it's hard. Workers with good 3D reconstructions of the animal's skeleton and reasonable estimates of the animal's volumes and tissue densities have repeatedly come up with somewhere around a quarter ton for northropi. That sounds heavy, but remember how big this animal is. It would mean that the animal's density is between 0.7 and 0.5 grams per cubic centimeter, which is as low or lower than the least dense living birds. Meanwhile, Lawson I, by using similar methods, winds up at around 30 kilograms, which is weirdly similar to what the similarly sized QN ornithopter wound up at. But those old heavy estimates have been a source of most of the contentions that these animals wouldn't be able to fly. The most recent work I could find seriously positing flightlessness for Quetzalcoatlus was in 2009 and 2010. Sato and company in 2009 attached accelerometers to albatrosses and related animals and took a more detailed look at how they fly than had been possible before. They found that minimum low-frequency flapping ability and maximum high-frequency flapping ability converge in very heavy birds, such that even giving it their all, very heavy birds can't maintain soaring flight, much less take off. But then they did that thing I was just complaining about where they took their bird graph and put pterosaurs into it, and oh, pterosaurs couldn't fly. Now, Henderson in 2010 calculated mass and wing loading for a bunch of pterosaurs, and most of his estimates have actually held up. But his reconstruction of Quetzalcoatlus was anatomically quite wrong. Crucially, his torso was almost twice the length that it should be, kind of similar to this toy in a lot of ways. And we've talked before about how the torso is such an important consideration when estimating mass volumetrically, so of course his calculations were off. Now, Henderson's very heavy Northropi compared unfavorably to the heaviest extant flying bird, the Cory bustard, so he raised the point that since these are obviously terrestrially adapted pterosaurs anyway, would it be that surprising if they were also flightless? And I see where he's coming from because it is important to think critically about things that seem obvious to us. 50 years ago, the head and neck of this animal seemed perfect for probing sauropod carcasses, but that's not what they were for. So maybe what looked to us like obvious flight adaptations weren't actually for flight. Fine, explore that option. They could fly, though. Witten and Habib in 2010 pretty comprehensively dismantled all of these arguments, both on, methodological grounds, but also conceptually. They point out that the flight musculature in pterosaurs is much more diffuse than it is in birds. In birds, both the upstroke and the downstroke are powered by those big muscles in the chest. That's why chicken breasts are so delicious. In a pterosaur, the muscles of the chest, the muscles of the back, the muscles of the shoulder, and many, many muscles in the arms are all contributing to flight. Actually, that difference between birds and pterosaurs might explain the position of the shoulder joint much more than any kind of aerodynamic or aerobatic considerations. It's just the muscles had to be there. More substantively, as pterosaurs increase in size, both phylogenetically and over the course of an individual animal's life, the skeletal hallmarks of flight, those robust limb bones, those wide load-bearing articulatory surfaces, the long jumping lever wing metacarpal, the fused shoulder girdle, the attachment sites for the flight muscles, those are all not only present in the largest forms, but exaggerated. 2023 research corroborated the ontogeny portion of that. Like I said, we don't have a good growth series for Azhdarkids, but all of the pterosaurs that they looked at, including the giant pteranodon, had better flight performance as adults than they did as juveniles. And there's something interesting about the way pteranodon grew. See, it's occasionally been proposed that the giant pterosaurs were flight capable as juveniles, but then were grounded once they reached their giant adult size. And this 2023 research suggests that there was a kind of a catch-22 preventing that. If precocial flaplings were flying around a lot because they couldn't rely on adult protection, then they would develop their adult form sooner, partially because their bodies just harden due to use. This is called ontogenetic canalization. It means that they can't reach gigantic sizes and they don't develop those exaggerated flight hallmarks that we see in giants. For example, they're not going to have a shorter distal wing and a longer proximal wing. They have to make do with what they have. Meanwhile, altricial flaplings, while apparently still flight capable, were protected and nurtured and could stay in that juvenile, plastic, fast-growing state longer, which means that their adult form could be much larger and much different from their juvenile form. They could have enlarged nataria, enlarged deltopectoral crest, enlarged wing joints, more extensive pneumatization, more positive allometry in the proximal limbs, more negative allometry in the distal limbs. Does any of this sound familiar? I really hope we someday get a good growth series for an Azhdarkid, because this does seem to fit their anatomy, right? This might even explain how Azhdarkids got so gigantic. Like, if these are primarily living on the ground, flying is the most dangerous thing a young pterosaur could do. So if they are primarily around their parents who are also hanging out on the ground, they're protected, and moving around terrestrially just puts less strain on their bodies than flying does. It's like they sort of min-maxed for being able to grow to gigantic sizes. And this is very speculative, but if this were the case, it could explain how Lawsoni has these close relatives that are much, much bigger than it. In any case, it would be funny if Quetzalcoatlus was a nurturing parent, given its recent portrayal as a baby eater. But I suppose in the prehistoric planet, I don't think the Quetzalcoatlus ate baby Quetzalcoatlus. It's been a while since I saw it. Anyway, we can rule out flightlessness at any stage of this animal's life history. Okay, one more thing about flightlessness, I promise. So, birds and insects become flightless all the time. Bats that we found never have. There are only 2 living bats that move along the ground with what we can even call a gait. So right off the bat, no pun intended, we shouldn't assume that every taxon is going to be as ground happy as birds are, and it's worth considering how birds acquire flightlessness on an evolutionary scale. Birds in environments where they don't have to escape predators, be that on the ground or especially other birds that specialize in hunting them, because you need to be a strong flyer to escape from such predators, they will be able to stop dumping so much energy into growing and maintaining large flight muscles. The advantage to this is intuitive. They don't have to have as high of a metabolism, they can subsist on less food, or they can invest those resources elsewhere. But even weakened flying is still useful, so how does a bird with less strong flight muscles still take off? Well, they take a bigger jump with the hind limbs, because that gives them a higher initial airspeed and lets them produce more lift for less power. And how do you take a bigger jump? Well, you grow bigger hind limbs, which also gives you an advantage when you're moving along the ground, because you're more efficient at walking. And eventually a bird will hit this inversion point, where the advantages of those big, powerful hind limbs outweigh the advantages of continuing to be able to fly, and it becomes flightless. Whereas in pterosaurs, flight, launch, walking, and running all involve the forelimbs. So they don't have that trade-off. If they want to get better at taking off, they pump up those forelimbs. If they want to get better at moving on the ground, they pump up those forelimbs. I recognize that a secondarily flightless pterosaur would be a cool thing to find, but it's possible that it's unlikely to have occurred. And in any case, Quetzalcoatlus sure isn't it. This does leave the question of how well Quetzalcoatlus could fly. Witten and Habib in 2010 argued that it would primarily be looking for external sources of lift, updrafts, thermals, if it was in the air longer than a minute or 2, because it only has so much muscle power that it can provide before it's out of energy. But between the high velocity imparted by a quad launch and just the sheer amount of power that those anaerobic flight muscles could provide, they had like 1 kilometer to 1.5 kilometers to find an external source of lift. And I would observe that even if they didn't find one, they are now 1 kilometer away from whatever caused them to take off anyway, which might be enough. But Habib has repeatedly argued that Azhdarkids were intercontinental soarers, whereas a number of works have argued pretty much the opposite. In 2022, Goto and co-authors looked at the soaring performance in 3 living and 2 extinct birds, as well as Pteranodon and Quetzalcoatlus northropi. They found that heavy pterosaurs with their high wing loading would have poor performance as dynamic soarers, which is that thing that some seabirds do, but they also found that northropi specifically would have poor performance as a thermal soarer, at least at low altitudes, where thermals and updrafts are narrower and the flying animal has to circle more tightly. Quetzalcoatlus would really have trouble circling tightly enough and climbing fast enough to actually get up one of those. Now this does make sense, given that these are primarily terrestrial animals, and it squares with 2020 research that took a zoomed out view of flight efficiency across Pterosauria, which found that in terms of how costly it was to move their mass around and how quickly they'd sink during a glide, pterosaurs broadly were improving over the entire Mesozoic, except Azhdarkids specifically kind of plateaued. But I'm going to nitpick the Goto et al. Paper anyway because it's my show and I get to be pedantic. They did try to account for the ways that pterosaur flight and bird flight differ. For one thing, pterosaurs just produce more lift than a bird of the same size would. They tried to account for the way that a pterosaur wing works, but this mostly manifested as modeling a pterosaur that can't adjust its span, which doesn't make sense to me. They tried to account for the fact that the membrane needs to stay taut, and they even looked at what would change if the Cretaceous atmosphere was different in density than it is today. But ultimately, at the risk of oversimplifying, they are just taking a very sophisticated look at how birds fly, writing some equations, and then finding that when you plug pterosaurs into those equations, they perform poorly. Like, again, I'm not trying to be reductive here, but this is essentially a very nuanced look at a couple of ways that being big and heavy make flying hard. This research also raises some more questions, some of which they pose themselves, like how windy of an environment was Northrop High living in? How much updraft does a thermal actually provide to an animal? How well did the smaller Azhdarkids like Quetzalcoatlus lawsoni perform? We have a description of that animal now, use it. And not to be glib, but if Azhdarkids were such poor short-range flyers, how come we find such closely related animals on opposite sides of the planet? There is so much research considering and reconsidering the aerodynamics of these animals that sometimes we come across as like armchair pterosaurs, like we know better than them. Reading about QN, the ornithopter, I was stricken by the, I won't say hubris, the confidence of those engineers being like, oh yeah, we humans, we've been flying for like 2 generations. We can bang out 150 million years of biomechanical refinement in a few months. I'm not saying the project wasn't worthwhile. They clearly learned a lot, and actually, like, learning aerodynamics and aeronautics from pterosaurs is a field of study that has grown up alongside our understanding of Azhdarkids, which is very cool. But my main takeaway, to the extent I have one, is that historically, we humans have been flying about half as long as we have known about pterosaurs, so maybe it's not surprising that our understanding of flight has limited interpretations of Quetzalcoatlus just as often as it's enhanced it. But I want to thank you guys for watching Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. We would like to extend a special thank you to these individuals who have gone above and beyond to support this show. We could not have done it without you. Thank you.